Fair Play, a novel by Pete Fisher. Chapter 8. Tripping and Crashing. Martin was sitting at the wooden table in the living room near the open window. He could see the trees in the park just the other side of the road. The noise of birdsong and kids playing on the swings in the playground drifted into the room. He stared intently into his cup of coffee, unaware that he'd been doing so for over half an hour. Its contents had long since gone cold. The sunlight reflecting on the surface of the coffee had first caught his attention about an hour after he'd arrived. He simply noticed concentric circles at first. These became greater in number and ever more intricate. They began to be edged with prism-like rainbow colours, spilling over the edge of the cup, onto the table and down onto the carpet. Gradually the whole room seemed to be filled with colour. At first transparent rainbows covered every surface, but then fascinating geometric patterns. They seemed to dazzle Martin, but also transfixed him. Michael and Jane ran the community centre. Michael was sitting cross-legged on the Persian rug by the fireplace. He was wearing headphones and holding a joint. His eyes were shut, and he had a beatific grin on his face. He had a kind of aura around him. Martin had never seen anyone look so at peace. Jane sat on the sofa with her crochet. She looked up every now and then to check the day trippers were okay. Michael put the music on speakers, some gentle West Coast rock. Martin noticed how intensely it affected him. He got a kind of warm feeling inside, combined with elation. Michael passed him the joint, and Martin took a hit. It had a pleasant, calming effect, a physical sensation, as opposed to the mostly cerebral effect of the half-tab. His sense of time became distorted. What felt like an eternity was probably just a couple of hours. Martin felt totally comfortable in those homely surroundings. There were posters and exotic paintings adorning the walls, and a colourful throw and matching cushions on the sofa. There was a large, very expensive hi-fi system with several long shelves full of LPs. Gradually the effects began to wear off. Jane made some tea and rolled another joint. Martin could come back down to earth gently. It had probably been about 5 hours. It was just beginning to get dark outside. He got up from the table and took his tea over to the sofa. He put his head back and closed his eyes. He dozed off briefly into a gentle reverie. When he came to again, Jane was busy in the kitchen. The soothing sizzle and smell of cooking. Michael poured out some wine. They all sat down together at the table for supper. Michael was curious. "So how was your first trip, Martin?" "Amazing." "That was a good way to start. It's not something you should do every week, though." "I know, but I'm definitely going to try it again. Maybe a whole tab next time. Just make sure you always do it in a nice place, with nice music and nice people." Martin had enjoyed the trip, but it wasn't a good idea. It shook him up. His folks splitting up had hit him harder than he'd anticipated. His mum was miles away. He'd given up on his dad. He hated his job. The band had stopped rehearsing after only a handful of gigs. Brian had a kid now. Rich was busy with A-levels. Keith had saved up enough for a flat of his own. Cass was moving in with him. Martin was on his own now. Martin had his eyes closed. He was dreaming he was in the back of a car. He could hear the whine of a tuned engine, a brief blip on the throttle as the driver double-declutched. It was bumpy. Every unevenness in the road seemed to bang and shake the whole car. It must have a very stiff suspension. He slowly opened his eyes. It was dark outside. He could just make out trees and fields flashing by in the moonlight. "You all right, mate? You had an accident." Martin was sitting next to a young woman. She poured out some sweet tea from a flask and held the cup to Martin's lips. "Drink some of this, you're in shock." After a couple of sips, Martin started to remember. He was at a beach party till very late. He only had a couple of beers, maybe a few tokes on a joint, but he was dog-tired after his 6-day week. He went for a drive afterwards instead of going straight home. Somewhere out in the countryside, listening to Pink Floyd on the cassette player, it all went black. "You fell asleep, mate. Hit a tree. Good job you didn't have a seatbelt on. You were lying next to the car. We saw you when we came past on the all-night rally." Martin couldn't say anything. He took a few more sips of sweet tea. "Found your address and your driving licence. We're taking you home now." Martin fell into a half-sleep for 10 minutes. Then he saw they were pulling up outside his bedsit. The woman and her friends helped him out of the car, fished his keys out of his pocket, and got him up to the flat. They sat him down on the bed. His clothes were covered in little flecks of blood. He had small cuts on his face and arms from the windscreen glass. The young woman looked sceptical. "You be all right, mate?" Martin nodded. "Thanks for bringing me home." "Get some sleep, mate. The law will be round when they find the car. Don't worry, it'll be too late for a breath test by then. Car's a write-off, though." The rally crew shut the door behind them. Martin took off his shoes and pulled off his jeans. He flopped full length on the bed, exhausted. Someone was hammering on the flat door, loud enough to wake the whole house. It was light outside. Martin groaned and sat up on the bed. "Just a minute." Martin put on his jeans and fumbled with the belt buckle. "Mr. Dalgleish, open the door, please. This is the police." All right. Martin opened the door. 2 uniformed officers stood in the hallway. "Morning, Mr. Dalgleish. Are you the owner of the green minivan? Registration number EDY259C? Martin nodded. "You'll have to come with us, please. You ploughed through about 50 yards of fencing. There are sheep wandering all over the dual carriageway. Farmer's doing his nut." In the car on the way, the policeman in the passenger seat did a bit of probing. "So you had a couple of drinks last night then, son?" "I only had 2 pints. I was tired. I must have fallen asleep." "Lucky you didn't kill someone, mate. Your car looks like a bloody scrunched-up crisp packet." They arrived at the scene of the accident. Martin saw that he must have drifted to the wrong side of the road, driven through the wooden fencing, and then hit a tree head-on. When he saw the car, he almost vomited on the spot. He quickly turned away. One of the policemen steadied him by grabbing his shoulder. "All right, easy, son." The flimsy Mini was bent and crushed beyond recognition at the front. He must have been thrown out of the door. Martin's car had been his pride and joy. The farmer, who'd just arrived, was furious. "You little sod, you'll pay for this, mark my words. They should take away your licence." The policemen did their best to pacify him. The third-party insurance would cover the damages. The car would have to be towed away and scrapped. The police took statements from Martin and from the farmer. They made a rough sketch of the scene of the accident. They took Martin home and said he'd be hearing from them. Martin sat miserably on his bed. He just wished he'd gone straight home after the party. His car had been his freedom, his independence. Now it was gone. Martin still had lots of friends, but people rarely came round since Keith had moved out. He missed Cass. They'd meet up in the pub. Brian had got married just after they had a little baby girl. He was tied up with family life. Rich had started working in a bank. He didn't seem interested in getting the band going again. Martin didn't have the energy to put a new band together. His life seemed to have gone into a nosedive. Martin decided one day he'd simply had enough. He had to get out of town. He wondered if his mum could put him up. It wouldn't be for long. It was late summer, almost the end of his year out after school. He'd hear soon if he'd got a place at university. It was all a bit spur of the moment. One Sunday he packed a bag, jumped on a train, and turned up unannounced at his mum's place. She was somewhat taken aback. She scolded him at first for not letting her know. After a while she softened. She realised he was desperately unhappy. After tea and sympathy, they had a strategy meeting. Martin could stay until he heard about his university place. He got a job working behind a bar at a pub in a neighbouring village, which tided him over for the time being. It was obvious he couldn't stay for long at his mum's place, sleeping on the sofa. About halfway through September, an official-looking envelope addressed to him popped through the letterbox. He ripped it open and read the contents. "London! Mum! I've got a place and a flat, starting in 2 weeks.